Mrs. M. Priyadarshini, ME MBA, is doing PhD, is currently working as teaching fellow in the Department of IST, Anna University, Chennai. She completed a Master's in Software Engineering from Anna University. She has about 10 years of experience in handling courses for UG and PG. She was serving as Technical Evangelist for corporate over 4 years in Java Enterprise Technologies, Software Engineering, Databases, OOAD and Design Patterns. She is proficient in handling IT projects as well into concept development for enterprises. She is doing a research in the area of web services security. Her other areas of interest include software engineering, OOAD, databases, enterprise technologies and service-oriented architecture. She holds many journal publications and conference proceedings in her research area.
Welcome to UGC lecture series in Computer Science, Java Part 6. So, in today's session, we are going to see about exceptions. What is exception? How exception handling is done in Java, predefined exceptions, and then we are going to see how you can create user defined exceptions and how you can use them. So, exception. An exception is a problem that arises during the execution of a program that could affect the normal execution of the program. So, for example, if you are trying to do any operations in a Java program and that raises an abnormal condition which makes your program to quit from your normal execution, then that is said to be an exception. So, for example, you are trying to give an input, that input is not a particular valid data type. So, then this may gives rise to a exception. So, here we could see few exceptions such as invalid data type entry, unable to open a file, network connectivity establishment could not be done. So, invalid data type. So, for example, you are trying to give value of int and then you are trying to assign that to a value of float, and then you have double value, you are trying to assign that to float. So, in this cases there is a possibility of invalid data type entry. And next is unable to open a file. So, you are trying to open a file which is not available. So, then this type of exception is raised. And with respect to network, you are trying to connect to your IP address which is not available, which is unavailable, which is not connected to your system, that is through the network. So, in that cases network connectivity establishment could not be done. So, then you cannot proceed with your normal program execution. So, we will look into types of exceptions. So, checked exceptions. Exceptions that are to be handled during compilation time. These must be explicitly caught. Example, if a file is to be opened, but the file cannot be found, an exception occurs. So, this could be called as file not found exception. So, this type of exception is raised. So, whenever you write a Java program and then you try to compile it, so using your Java C, during compilation there are set of exceptions called checked exceptions which are checked during the compilation itself. So, in that case these exceptions are identified, so that you have not handled these exceptions, that is identified during the compilation time itself. Those type of exceptions are said to be checked exceptions. So, whenever I try to compile it, I can identify that there may be a possibility of this exception to be raised and we should try to handle the exception. So, that is a must during the compilation itself. Next is runtime exceptions. Runtime exceptions are ignored at the time of compilation, can be avoided by good programming practice. So, for example, array index out of bound exception, string index out of bound exception. So, with respect to a runtime exception, during compilation time you cannot identify these types of exceptions. So, this is purely based on the programmer's programming skill. So, if a programmer is programming properly and he is catching all his exception and he is handling all that, so you can try to avoid this runtime exception. Otherwise, these exceptions could not be identified during the compilation time. So, what we have to do is we have to, from our programming logic, we have to find that whether there is any possibility of this particular exception being raised, and then we can write our handling mechanism such a way. So, errors. these are not exceptions at all, but problem that arise beyond the control of the user or the programmer, like stack overflow error, out of memory error. So, this error is raised by your runtime environment. So, whenever you are trying to have a program and then for example, I am allocating a memory, I am trying to create a new object instance. So, at that point of time when I do not have particular memory which is needed in order to create that particular object or set of objects. So, in that case these type of errors may occur. So, this is the control of this is not with respect to the user or not with respect to the programmer. So, in that case this could be handled. So, for example, if it is a very system intensive application, so then we have to look into whether these type of errors occur and then we should handle it accordingly. So, we have a look on exception hierarchy. So, throwable is the base exception type. So, from that we have error and then exceptions. Under exceptions we have IO exceptions, your SQL exception like your checked exceptions and then runtime exceptions. So, here you can see that all belong to type throwable. So, error is also throwable and exception is also throwable. So, what do you mean by this throwable? So, whenever my JRE is under its execution, whenever I am in running my program in the environment to run my program, so some intermediate or abnormal execution or some abnormal conditions which may raise or throw my exception. So, that is why it is said to be throwable. Next is here you can see IO exception. So, IO exception is nothing but the exception which are raised whenever you do your input output operation, like you are trying to open a file and then you are trying to open a buffer reader, your system.in, all these options. Next is SQL exception. So, SQL exception is whenever you are trying to make a connectivity with the database, whenever you are trying to query it. So, for example, whenever I am trying to connect to a database which is not available or the database may have some user ID and password which is not matched with your string that you have passed as the parameter for making the connectivity, or else you are trying to access a table which is not available, or else you would have tried to access some fields which is not available, some mismatch in the fields, all these will be handled using this SQL exception. So, runtime exceptions, this is raised like your null pointer exceptions, you are trying to access an object which is not been assigned with any memory. So, if it has not been assigned with any memory, automatically this gives you a null pointer exception. So, array index out of bounds exception. So, whenever you can see in programming language like C and C++, whenever you are trying to access an array variable, so you have declared an array of size 10. So, if you are trying to access the 11th element, so that will not give you an error, but instead it will give you a junk value. Whereas, with respect to Java, whenever I am trying to access a value which is above the limit or maximum limit of the array, in that case we have a exception being raised, that is array index out of bound exception, and then number format exception. So, I am trying to I am expecting a particular number format, but I am giving an input which is not matching with that particular number format. So, that may give rise to number format exception. So, now how to handle these exceptions? Java's exception handling is managed using the following keywords. One is try, catch, throw, throws and finally. So, these are all the keywords which are used to do exception handling mechanism in Java. So, we will have a look on what is try. So, there is a block called try block. So, inside this try block we will have a set of statements, that is the code, and then after that we will have a catch statement. So, under this catch statement we have a parameter, that parameter will be having any type of exception. So, and then there will be an object of that particular type of exception being catched here. Here I can have my catch block also. So, whenever the exception is catched, what handling should be done, that is a set of statements that should be executed will be there in handle the exception, and there is a block called finally block. So, this is the block which has to be executed before your program ends. So, here we will discuss on each and every keyword used. Try. So, what does this try mean? So, whenever you have a set of statements in the try block, so each and every statements inside the try block will be executed. When a statement which could raise an exception is occurring, and then if there is any violation and you are about to find an exception, your runtime environment is about to find an exception, then automatically that will create an object of that particular type of exception and throw that exception. So, throw is the keyword that is used in order to throw the instance of an exception. So, it will throw the instance. So, for example, if I am trying to make a database connectivity and if that particular database is not available, then automatically that will give rise an SQL exception. So, in that case, that SQL exceptions, one particular object will be instantiated and it will be thrown by your runtime environment. So, that is what is catched using your catch block. So, here is catch is nothing but this is going to catch the exception that is thrown by the keyword throw. So, here this type of exception which we are trying to catch may be under any one of the base exception. So, for example, if IO we have IO exception we have, it will be having a base class of your exception. So, anyway that comes under the type of exception, and then we will have a parameter, that is your argument. That argument is nothing but the object which is being thrown. So, that this argument consists of the object that is thrown, and from that also you can have many information, what type of exception it is, lot of other information could be gathered from this particular exception object. So, then after that we will have a catch block. So, inside the catch block what handling that you have to do will be mentioned. So, for example, if I am trying to have an array index out of bounds exception, so what should be done in that case? So, I should intimate it to the user that you are trying to access an element which is not available. So, that could be done in your catch block. And then in your finally block, so for example, I would have opened many connections, many statements, many files, all these would have been opened. So, finally, we will make us to do all the preliminary operation that need to be done before we come out of the program whenever an exception is catched. So, when an exception is catched, you will come out of the catch block. So, before that this finally will be executed. So, all the open connections, everything will be closed. Here is an example of uncaught exception. So, here we have class test and then we have a main method. In that we have an integer variable x is equal to 0 and y is equal to 60 by x. So, now I have assigned a value of x is equal to 0 here. So, now system.out.print I am trying to print the y value. So, this will give or raise an exception called your divide by 0, that is nothing but arithmetic exception. So, arithmetic exception will be raised, whereas here I did not write any handling mechanism, we have not written any handling mechanism. So, what will happen whenever I compile this and whenever I run this, this will raise an abnormal exception and then it will come out of my program execution. So, that is what, although this program will compile, but when you execute it, the Java runtime system will generate an exception and displays the following output on the console. So, it will say java.lang.arithmetic exception divide by 0 at test main in which line number. So, here you can notice that this arithmetic exception is available in the package lang package java.lang package, and this is available in the execution of your main method. So, and then in which line number you have that exception being raised. All these information you can gather from your exception that has been printed on your console once an exception is raised. So, now I have told that this is uncaught exception. So, how to catch this exception and write some statements in order to find out what is the problem exactly that has caused my program to abnormally execute. So, now you can see the try block. So, I have put the statements which are likely to throw the exception. So, here these statements are likely to throw the exception. So, I have put that inside the try block. So, after that I have written a catch block and then I have written the exception that is likely to be caught. So, arithmetic exception. So, here E is the object of arithmetic exception that will be thrown once this particular statement is executed, because x value I have assigned statically to be 0 and then this 0 will be substituted over here and for sure this will raise an exception. So, that exception from your JRE will be thrown and that will be catched by this catch block. So, once this catch block catches that particular exception, the object name will be E. So, now I am giving system.out.println divide by 0 error, or even I can say E.getMessage, even I can give E.print stack trace. So, if I use E.getMessage, it will just give the same information. So, here I have given division by 0 myself instead of this automatically get message variable that is assigned to that particular exception class will be printed. Or else if I print e dot print stack trace, so in that case this stack trace of from where this particular exception has emerged will be given. So now we will have a short break and come and continue with the multiple catch block statements. Welcome back. We are going to look about multiple catch blocks and then user define exception, predefine exception and so on. So what do you mean by multiple catch blocks? So if statements in the try block throw different type of exception that can be handled by multiple catch block. So you can see that here we have a try block and then I have a catch block. I have an exception called known exception. I know how to handle this. So in your previous example we have seen that arithmetic exception is raised. Whereas if you have a set of statements in which there is a possibility that you may have more number of exception to be raised. So few of them may have some handling mechanisms and few of them may not have the handling mechanism. So in that case if I know what handling mechanism is to be done for this type of exception, I can particularly catch that using the known exceptions. So that is if I know arithmetic exception is likely to be raised, I can write for that. And if there is any possibility that some other exception could also be raised, so in that case I can write generically as catch exception E. So here exception is a superclass of all the other classes. So whatever may be the exception that will be catched, that is after typecasting it will be typecasted into the base class exception and it will be caught and then you will print what type of exception it is. So here you have to note that whenever I use multiple catch blocks, I have to see that the first catch, all my first and foremost catch blocks should have its parameter as all derived exceptions. So if at all I put my base exception, so for example you can think that instead of me writing this as the second catch statement, if I have used this as my first catch statement, so whatever may be the exception, it may be the known exception, it may be unknown exception, whatever exception is raised, it is catched by the first catch block itself. So there is no possibility that your second catch block or the other forthcoming catch blocks, even though have different exception handling mechanism, could be executed, because whatever the exception is raised, that is of type exception. So only first exception is always executed. So in order to avoid that, you have to see to that your base exception comes last and then your derived exceptions comes as the first catch blocks. So here is an example. Public class test, the same example that we have seen. Here you can see that args. So I am trying to take the command line arguments. So args of 0 is considered as the value for x and args of 1 is considered as the value for a. So here you can see that you have a arithmetic exception being catched and then I have array index out of bounds exception being catched, because I am trying to access the string array. I am trying to access the string array that is nothing but my command line arguments. So in that case there is a possibility that I may give only few elements leaving out the other elements. So in that case I will not have my array values, all the array. If I am in need of, here in this case I am in need of 0 value and 1 value. If I give only 1 value, so then this could not be executed. So absolutely it will give me the array index out of bounds exception. So this will be executed after the multiple catch statement. So you can see that this program, so I am giving test 0. So this is args of 0 value and this is args of 1 value. So x is assigned with 0. So this will automatically raise the arithmetic exception. So next I am trying to run Java test 12. So in this case this will raise an array index out of bounds exception. So it means that I have only one parameter here. So I want args of 0 as well as args of 1. So here I have only args of 0, I do not have args of 1. So in that case my array value, that is my string array, I am trying to access args of 1 which is not available. So array index out of bounds exception will be raised. Throws. If a method does not handle a checked exception, the method must declare it using the throws keyword. The throws keyword appears at the end of the method signature. So here we have already seen about a word called throw, and throws is nothing but it's a keyword which is added at the end of the method signature to indicate that these are all the exception which are to be likely thrown by this particular method. So, this keyword could be used in case if you are not trying to do your try catch, that is your handling mechanism, you are not going to implement your handling mechanism, and your JRE, you want your JRE to handle this type of exceptions. So, in that case I can go in for using the keyword called throws. So, you can see that public int convert string s throws number format exception. So, it means that there is no need for me to write try block, catch block. So, normal exception handling mechanism is done instead of abnormally exiting from your program. Instead of abnormally exiting from your program, this will have handling mechanism that is done by your normal JRE itself. So, next we will see the exception handling rules. What are all the rules that we have for exception handling? So, catch clause cannot exist without a try statement. So, whenever I have a catch statement, I should have a try block. So, without try I cannot write a catch block. Next, it is not compulsory to have finally classes whenever a try catch block is present. So, it means that your finally block is not a mandatory, it is optional, but it is always good practice to do all the operations which need to be done, which will cause some abnormal problems in your system. Like I already told you that connections need to be closed, all the files that is open, everything need to be closed. Since whenever you are in a normal execution, then it is fine. Whenever you come out, you will close all the opened objects and you will come out. Whereas in case if you are abnormally exiting due to some exception, you are trying to exit. So, in that case what you have to do is you have to do everything in finally. Try block cannot be present without either catch clause or finally clause. So, you cannot have your try block alone. So, whenever you have a try block, for sure you should have some catch block and then your finally block. Any code cannot be present in between try, catch, finally blocks. So, it means that whenever I have try, so I have a block of statements. So, and then I have a catch statement and then a block of statements, finally and then a block of statements. So, I cannot have a statement or set of statements in between my try block and then the catch statement. That is what is given. So, for whatever we have discussed was already predefined exceptions. So, it means that all these exceptions are given by Sun's Java API. So, there is a possibility that we may think few business in our business logic, we may think that with respect to our system these are all called exceptions. So, for example, you can take, so in our organization we may have a class called employee. So, in case of employee clause, our business rule may be you cannot have employees age less than 18 and greater than that of 60. So, with respect to us it is an exception, but it is not an exception with respect to your normal or any Java program, because it is an acceptable integer, because normally whenever you give a age you will give it as int. So, for int this value is correct, it may be 16, 18, 20 or it may be 70. With respect to your integer variable, nothing is wrong with this, no exception would be raised. Whereas, with respect to our system, our application, the business rule is you cannot have this value. So, what I can do is I can create my own exception called age exception and then use it. Similarly, I can use size exception. So, if somebody is going to give a size of a particular element or for a limit exception. So, if I am going to give a limit value, so then I can restrict all these values by giving a proper exception and then I can handle them accordingly. So, you can see that all exception must be child of throwable. It means that whenever you create a user defined exception, it should be child of throwable. To write a checked, extend the exception class. If I want to write a checked exception, I can just extend the exception class. To write a runtime exception, I have to extend the runtime exception class. Already I have clearly told you what is checked and then what is runtime exception. So, checked in the sense during the compilation itself we will ensure that there is a handling mechanism for that particular type of exception. Whenever it is a runtime exception, we never ensure that the compile time, and then on runtime I need to do the handling mechanism. Here user defined exception is again a class. So, here public class my exception, I am trying to create my own exception, extends the exception. So, what type of exception it is? So, it is ultimately a checked exception. Public my exception, so I have a constructor, but I do not have any body in this constructor. Here I have test exception, a class. Here in this test method I write a keyword called throws and my exception. So, it means that this method is likely to throw my exception. So what I can do is, here I can throw the instance of the my exception. So this method need to handle that. So here is a demo. Public class size exception extends the exception. So I have written an exception called size exception, and then in the constructor I have called super my base class constructor. So I have a class called public class square and I have a variable called side in that. So now here you can see that this public square throws size exception. So it means that this is likely to throw size exception. Yes greater than 25 means I am going to create a new instance of the size exception and say that the size could not be greater than 25. So with respect to me, this is an exception. So for this I have created an exception, I have created an object of the exception and I have thrown it. So else side I am assigned the size. So I have written my exception in the constructor itself. So I have set side method which is going to set the value, get side method which is going to get the value. I am going to calculate the area. So in display I have the area been calculated and it has been displayed. So now you can see that we have a public class calculator. This is another class which is going to use your square class. Public void process, there is a method. This method is likely to throw IO exception or size exception. So here square, I have created a new square object and then I am trying to display. So whenever I call this constructor, what will happen? You can see here the size will be checked for. If the size is greater than 25, automatically this exception will be raised. So that should be catched by your particular program. So here we have not written any try catch block. It means that JRE will handle these exception and will have a normal execution. So here you can see public void main throws IO exception. I am creating an instance of the calculator. So I am giving an A is equal to 15. So now I have try catch block and then here I have written a try catch block to catch this exception. This method will raise the size exception and this method, this main method, I have written a handling mechanism which is going to catch the exception, size exception that is raised by the method of square. So the square, my constructor is going to raise this exception and this exception is going to be handled by JRE using the method called process. Here in this case, the programmer has written the handling mechanism. So whenever I call calculator's process method and then I assign the value, this method will be called. So this will call the squares constructor. So now a size exception is raised and then here I have catched the exception. So whatever the exception that is thrown will be catched and then I call the get message exception. So here this get message is nothing but a method which is a getter method. So always in exception class you have a variable called message. That message variable will be assigned with a value. Whenever I construct an exception, the exception's message value will be set automatically during the construction of that particular exception. So and then set message will be called and then your get message will call what is the message that has been set to your base class exception. So here you can notice that I have super ex. So whatever the string that I am trying to pass through this size exception will be assigned to the message. So now whenever I call se.getMessage, whatever the message that I have given in the constructor of that will be passed on and then that will be printed here. So now as a summary we have seen what is an exception, what are all the types of exceptions we have, how exception handling is done in Java, about predefined exception. So what are all the predefined exception that is already available in Java, and then we have also seen example for creation and usage of user defined exception. So this user defined exception is nothing but the exception which is with respect to the application and not with respect to your normal Java runtime environment, or it is not the set of exception that is given by Sun's own API. So from this session you will be able to answer the questions like differentiate the checked and runtime exception, what is user defined exception, how is throws different from throw, and then we also know what is use of finally block. So and then we will continue with all the other concepts in Java in your forthcoming sessions. Thank you.